Well, I hope you enjoyed the documentary, and we went right into it because there wasn't, of the technical difficulties, we weren't able to have the introduction. So, and maybe that's a good thing too, because you can just kind of be overwhelmed by that just watching it. I would like to introduce you to BruceAllen, who's going to give you a talk about Ishimura Michiko and a number of other things that are relevant to this particular documentary. And I'll just start with a brief introduction to him, and then I'll turn it over to him. So BruceAllen is a researcher and translator specializing in environmental literature and the work of Ishimura Michiko. He recently retired as professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at Seisen University, Japan, where he taught environmental literature and translation. His translated works of Ishimura Michiko include her novel Lake of Heaven, which some of us are reading, her no play, Shiranu, and the documentary film Toward the Paradise of Flowers, which we just watched. He co-translated a collection of 90 stories from the medieval Japanese collection of stories, Konjaku Monogatari Shu, or Japanese Tales from Times Past, stories of fantasy and folklore from the Konjaku Monogatari Teri Shu. He also co-edited and contributed to the critical study of Ishimura Michiko's work, Ishimura Michiko's Writing in Eco-Critical Perspective, Between Sea and Sky. And he lives in Tokyo, Japan, and he told me that this past weekend he was going to see a new film about the Minamata crisis, and I'm interested to hear about that as well, perhaps during Q&A. Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's get started. Thank you very much, Shoshana, and hello to you all in Newfoundland. I'm very happy to join you today here from Tokyo. Actually, I had hoped to be there in person in Canada and join you, but coronavirus situation got in the way and prevented travel plans. So today I'm going to talk about the literature and the activism of Ishimura Michiko. That's her name in Japanese word order with the family name first and the given name last. So her literature and activism and some of my work in translation and introduction to the documentary film Toward the Paradise of Flowers. Actually, you've already seen it, so what I'll do today is more like a kind of review and stressing some of the main points and perhaps repeat a few of the quotations that you've already seen from the film. Tomorrow, I'm going to be showing another documentary film titled The Lost Manchurian Shamans, and both of these films are very interrelated with themes of the problems of nature and loss of culture, loss of language, these kind of problems in Japan and China, but also I think are happening in your country of Canada as well. So as you watch these films, I hope that you will look for the kinds of interconnections between all of these ideas and be able to relate them to your situation in China, and hopefully at the end, either today or tomorrow or both days, we'll have a chance to ask some questions or hear your comments on those kinds of things. So let me begin by introducing Ishimura Michiko. This picture was taken about 20 years ago from her, and I had the pleasure and honor of working together with the author a number of times in my translation. Very inspiring writer and activist. So today I'll try to talk about the combination of her literature and her activism. Some of you may have been introduced to her already by Professor Gantz, but very briefly, Ishimure Michiko is the writer of over 50 books in many genres. Some people have sort of pigeonholed her as a kind of environmental crisis writer. Certainly she talks about environment, but her total work includes many kinds of writing, including fictional novels, nonfiction essays, historical fiction, children's stories, no drama, poetry, a genre we might call reportage fiction, and memoirs and autobiography. As I said, she's both a writer and an activist, and I'd like to talk about the interconnection of those two activities today. She's also quintessentially a modern storyteller, working from the oral tradition of storytelling that gives her writing a special kind of vibrancy and style, which I would like to briefly talk about today as well. She is the recipient of a number of important literary awards, including the Raman Magsaysay Award from the Philippines, which is often regarded as the Asian Nobel Prize, and also the Asahi Prize for Literature in Japan, among other awards. So today I'd like to make a rather bold claim, which is that Ishimure may be and may eventually come to be recognized as the most important modern post-war writer of Japan. To tell the truth, actually, I don't like the idea of ranking one best, first, second, third best writers. Perhaps I should just say she's among the top modern writers, and I believe her reputation will only get stronger as time passes, as more of her work becomes introduced to the world and such. So I believe that she brought a new narrative style, a new genre, and a new social environmental conscience to the world in Japan, but also to world literature as well. She's a famous, well-respected writer, and yet there are some problems in the recognition of especially her more recent work, her later work. Her first published work, The Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow, sold well over 30 million copies. It's still in print and still read widely in Japan. And she is known as the Rachel Carson of Japan and as the mother of the environmental movement in Japan. And she has been highly praised by literary critics in Japan and in other countries. However, for a number of reasons, unfortunately, her more recent work after Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow has not received the full attention that I think it deserves, and which I think a lot of other literary critics would agree. It deserves more attention. This may take some time, but we're working on that kind of recognition. Why has her later work not received as much attention? I think part of it is the problem that she was kind of early on stereotyped as a social environmental activist for the Minamata problem. And some people have the, I would say, mistaken view that an activist cannot be a great literary writer and vice versa. A great writer should not be involved in activism. I think that's a mistake and a prejudice, but it's sort of pigeonholed the identity of Ishimure, and I hope that people will realize her total life work spans many genres that have not been fully looked into yet. Secondly, in a similar way, there's a certain kind of prejudice that some people have against so-called literature and environmental literature. Some people see that as a kind of minor subgenre of literature. But again, her literature spans many genres. It should not be just regarded as environmental literature. She rarely uses the word environment or ecology or those kind of terms, her work is much more storytelling based, based on the lives and stories of people and grassroots kind of activities rather than abstract ideas. So, and another difficulty with reception of her work is that some people believe that her writing style is difficult. It's non-linear oral literature style of narration. I'll talk about that non-linear oral style in a moment. And then finally, especially in the international world, the lack of translations of her work has prevented its greater acceptance. So that's something that I, as a translator, am working on, and other translators are working on, so that we hope that there will be more works of hers in English translation, so that international readers may enjoy her work. Today I'm going to talk about, in particularly, two of her most well-known works that are both in English translation. The first is Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow. The subtitle is Our Minamata Disease from 1969. And the second is Lake of Heaven, 1997. I think some of you have read some of this in Professor Gantz's class. Today I'll read a few excerpts from these works that kind of will exemplify her style of writing and the themes of her writing. Again, in talking today, I'd like to stress this idea that literature and activism can go together and reinforce each other. This is something that Ishimure's life work has shown, that you can be an activist and a writer, and both of those activities go together. As for my work and my hope is to help introduce Ishimure's work to the world through English translation, leading to her proper recognition as a major writer of world literature. This phenomenon of a writer not being appreciated in her own country is not unique to Ishimure. Thinking about American literature, you know Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, the poet Robert Frost, William Faulkner, Emily Dickinson. These are writers who were kind of overlooked in their own country for some years, but then other readers in other countries recognized their value, and then belatedly they were accepted in their own country. So that I hope that we can inspire Japanese to rethink and reevaluate Ishimure's writing by its acceptance in the world community. To briefly introduce Minamata Disease, some of you may have heard about it, some of you may not be familiar. It emerged in the 1950s, 1960s, and it took a long time to be recognized what was the cause of it. But in effect, Minamata Disease was the world's first recognized incident of industrially caused environmental disease. Well, the term environmental disease, environmental crisis, today we take those for granted, but at that time, 1960s, this was a new idea that Ishimure brought to the fore. Also, American Rachel Carson worked on a similar idea, but the two writers didn't know each other's work at that time, so independently they brought these ideas to our attention. Minamata disease is a severe neurological and muscular disease caused by methylmercury poisoning. It first occurred in Ishimure's hometown of Minamata. In fact, she never intended to be a writer about environmental problems, but she saw this problem in her backyard, in her front door, so to speak. And so she interviewed the patients, and she also interviewed doctors and politicians, trying to look for the cause, and also worked for the solution, and sympathizing with the patients, and worked for the recovery of the ecosystem and the culture. So it was documented and protested against by Ishimure Michiko. Minamata disease occurs in many parts of the world, including in Canada. It's often related to the production of chemicals, munitions, fertilizers, gold and other metal mining and refining. And it often strikes especially vulnerable, poor, indigenous populations. So I'm going to show a number of black and white photos by the American photographer Eugene Smith, who immortalized this idea in his photography. And as Professor Gantz mentioned, very coincidentally, the new film titled Minamata is out in the theaters in Japan. I don't know about Canada yet, but I highly recommend this film. It features the well-known actor Johnny Depp, and he plays the role of this same Eugene Smith when Eugene Smith went to Minamata, and actually he met with Ishimure, and she introduced him to the patients and the problem. Unfortunately, in the film, her role doesn't show up, but it's a good film about this background. So I encourage you to see it. And these photos we're going to look at right now are by Eugene Smith. Let me go to the next one. Whoops. This one. This is his shot of a drain pipe from the Chiso company, which discharged the methyl mercury for many decades into the Minamata Bay, as this picture shows. So when this mercury went into the bay ecosystem, the fishermen caught the fish, and they ate the fish every day, lots and lots of fish eating. And so they were the first ones to become poisoned by Minamata disease. It later spread to farmers and other people who ate the fish, but especially the local fishermen were the primary victims of this outpouring of methyl mercury. And the result, as you can see in this picture, was deformity. This gnarled hand is a kind of iconic symbol of the state of disease, and you just vaguely see her face in the background, a face of suffering and disease. This picture is not by Smith, a Japanese photographer, but it too symbolizes the pain and the suffering, and also the request of the victims, the patients, for recognition. This picture shows some of the protesters against Minamata disease, the families of victims. Some of them have already died, going to court. They did eventually win some settlement against the government and against the chemical company Chiso, but really this issue is still unresolved, and there are still many victims who have not received compensation. So this is an ongoing issue in Minamata, Japan, but also throughout the world, in Canada as well. These are a mother and her daughter with the Minamata disease. They went to Stockholm for the first UN environmental conference back in the time when the idea of environmental problems was a new idea, almost not recognized by the world at that time. So bringing this young woman victim to show her to the UN conference was my evidence to wake up people that this was happening. So Minamata Disease and Ishimure's writing was a wake-up call to the world for recognizing the problem of Minamata Disease. Here are some of the negotiations or struggles between the patients, meeting with the company representatives of the Chiso company. You can see quite tough negotiations. Please see the film and see more of this background. Okay, I'm going to shift next to talk a little bit about my role in Ishimure literature, including the translation of her work. Lake of Heaven novel, which I translated in 2008. Briefly about my work as a translator. Translation for me includes joy, challenge, sweat, and creation. To me, translation is the deepest, slowest form of reading. It provides the most intimate relation with a writer's work and soul. That's the reason I enjoy translating in spite of the difficulty that it presents. But I'd also like to say to you as readers that even if you don't do translation yourself, try to imagine the creative work of translation. Because in some sense, you as a reader are also translating what you read. You are a translator. You're taking written words on a printed page, and you're translating them into your imagination of reality, making the writer's world come alive, imagining the nature and the environment behind the words. So we are, as readers, we are translating. I like to use the advice of the American poet Robert Frost. He encouraged us to be an ear reader, use our ears when we're reading. And I would, in a similar vein, say that we should be an ear translator, ear reader, ear translator. But of course, not only using our eyes, we should be an eye translator and reader, a nose reader, a tongue reader, skin reader, using all our senses when we read and translate. So I encourage you as readers to listen to the sounds of the words, the rhythm, the weight, the color, the smell, the taste, the feel of words, and try to bring this sense alive in your reading and translation. Okay, so I'm going to read a number of excerpts from Lake of Heaven, which I translated, and briefly about this book. Some of you have already started reading it, some of you may not, but it's a novel, but based on true stories which Ishimure-san collected from, just let me skip to she collected them from this area near where she lived. This is a reservoir created by a dam, and in making this reservoir, several towns were sunk. Their nature was taken away, but also their stories, their community, their traditions were taken away. So she asked the question of what happens when places are extinguished, and also how might we bring them, revive them, and bring back the culture that has been lost. So it's about dam construction and the impact on nature and culture and community and many other aspects of life. It deals with the loss of language and culture and nature, and talks about the interrelationship between those losses of all of those elements. And finally, it asks questions about how can we reconcile and recover from such losses. Again, I hope that you'll be able to apply these ideas to the film tomorrow about loss of culture and tribes and nature in China, and then connect them to situation in Canada as well. So again, this is the lake which inspired the novel Lake of Heaven. Ishimure-san took me to this area and talked about that. And in the film that you just watched, I think she gave you some of the reasons why she was inspired to write about this event. This is another picture of the dam, and here also in the area near this dam, there are a number of other dams that have been built, and the Japanese government after the war engaged in what you might say a spree of dam building. Some of them may have been necessary and valuable. Ishimure and myself were not totally against all dam construction, but it became necessary to question whether there was an excess of dam building and destruction of nature. So this area here, Kawakabe Dam, has been under construction for 40 years, but the protest movements by Ishimure and other local people have put a stop on this. And to make this dam, if it's completed, it would go back some 10 miles, a huge reservoir and dam. But this article is in Japanese, but it explains that for 40 years, protest movements have been going on to try to stop this construction. And in fact, the new plan is to, alternative plan is to make this area into a environmental recreation area, study area, fishing, hunting, ecotourism, and that kind of thing, which people argue even economically may be more beneficial for the people in that area than to build a new dam. Here's one more dam which Ishimure introduced me to. I went there about 20 years ago. It was still standing, but this is a historic case of the first instance in Japan where a dam, at the request of the local community, was destroyed, was removed. The government and the construction industry were shocked. They didn't want to do this, but it was an admission that maybe in some cases we don't need as many dams. And so in fact, as these pictures show, the dam has been removed as of 2014. Today, it has been restored to natural habitat. So again, this shows that activism and writing can go together and end up with compromise or even change and revision of ideas and restoration of nature, whether in the case of dams or Minamata situation. Okay, I'd like to mention briefly about Ishimure's distinctive narrative style. As I mentioned before, it's non-linear, meaning it doesn't just go from past to present and future in a line, but past, present, and future are spiraling around, recursive, returning. Time and space are recursive. This is something that I'll talk about today and again tomorrow in the film about Manchurian shamans, the idea of having a different conception of time and space. And also, this is rooted in Ishimure's strong oral tradition of storytelling, but used in a modern context, creating a new literary form. Oral tradition of storytelling. Perhaps you got a sense of this when you watch the film and when if you have been reading her story, Lake of Heaven. So I'll leave that idea up to you, but as you watch today's movie and tomorrow's movie, try to think about this tradition of non-linear narration and oral tradition of writing. And finally, her writing stresses the importance of preserving local dialects. She believes that the loss of dialects leads to the loss of culture, community, and environment. Today, with social media and TV and so many things, we are losing local dialects or even local languages as a whole group. So what can we do about that? Is that important? Those kind of questions come up in Ishimure's writing and her activism. So from now, I'd like to pick up a few of the important ideas and themes in her writing and life work and illustrate them by some excerpts from her novels, especially from Lake of Heaven, which I think some of you are already reading or will be reading. One of the first things that she stresses is, well, we talk about environmental problem and solving it and saving the world and things like that from top-down kinds of ideas of making new laws or new technology to solve the problem. But she would say the real work of saving the earth and working with the environment starts from the bottom up, from grassroots participation and looking at the world. So referring to the young man who's a character in the story named Masahiko, who goes to the countryside to experience nature for the first time, getting outside of Tokyo, she writes, Masahiko was becoming bound up with all the signs of life in the mountains and valleys, from the buds of the quince and magnolia to the faint gurgling of sounds of running water. All these trees, grasses, and flowers, whose names I hardly know, why have I never thought of their significance for the human world until now? But now it seems that here is where the world begins. Even a lump of dirt, you can't look at it as something trivial. There isn't a single element that's not essential to the Earth's makeup. Well, this sense of primary observation, looking and listening to the world, is the starting point of our ecological awareness, our environmental conscience. And this is the kind of feeling that comes out in all of Ishimure's work. She also stresses the idea that words have spirit, words have language, although in modern times, sometimes we're losing that sense of the deep spirit of language. She writes that back in the time when the true soul of language still existed, the human voice and the sounds of things must have been bound together far more closely than they are today. They must have existed in mystical relationship to the structure of the world. So she encourages us to revive that soul of language in modern day life. Also about this idea of sounds in hearing, she writes, as if he himself were grass, he began to realize that he was becoming able to hear clearly for the first time. Masahiko's entire body became an ear. It's a wonderful metaphor. His entire body became an ear. So he was becoming an ear reader, an ear translator, an ear liver. And his body was becoming like the grass. So she breaks down that kind of dichotomy between humans and non-human life. He becomes part of the grass. And she also stresses the importance of dreams, not only the dreams that we have when we're sleeping, but the dreams that we have in waking life, sort of like the Australian Aborigines' sense of dream time. She thinks that can exist in modern life as well. So she writes about one of the women characters, Ohina, and she says, when Ohina began telling the stories of her dreams, Masahiko also started to feel that he was in a place where people returned in dreams. It seemed there was no border between their times of waking and those of dreaming. They could travel freely between both. So her work suggests that we can reawaken the sense of dream time, connection between waking dreams and other dreams. And she talks about the importance of stories in our lives. Stories are being a forgotten kind of part of our culture. But she writes that in his childhood, Masahiko had thought of these tales of a far-off, forgotten mountain village as merely the fragments of memories of an old man, meaning his grandfather who had told him stories. But now that he went to the town of Amazoku where his grandfather had lived, now he's getting into nature. Now he had come to realize that in order to see into the world that had been hidden in his grandfather's mind, it wasn't necessary to resort to ideas from ethnology or recently fashionable ecological theories about saving the earth. All that was needed was to share in the feelings of these elders right here, these people who continue to return to Amazoku in their dreams. Ethnology, ecology may be important for us in the world today, but also these stories of the elders, the ancient stories and modern stories, storytelling tradition is essential to preserving nature. And then I'd like to read one quote from the novel Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow, and raising the question of Ishimure as a contemporary shaman or sorceress and animism. These ideas, I think, will connect to the film we'll watch tomorrow about Manchurian shamans. She writes that, "I know that the language of the victims of Minamata disease represents the pristine form of poetry before our societies were divided into classes. In order to preserve for posterity this language in which the historic significance of the mercury poisoning incident is crudely branded, I must drink an infusion of my animism and pre-animism and become a sorceress cursing modern times forever." My goodness, that's very inspired, passionate writing. Sounds like an angry sorceress. But in fact, Ishimure, she's tough, but she's also very sweet and working for reconciliation and rebirth. But she does her work in fighting for, as a sorceress, cursing modern times forever. Keep this in mind as you think about questions in Canada, and also if you hopefully will watch the film tomorrow about shamans in China, Manchuria. Okay, to introduce the film Paradise of the Flowers, of course you've already seen it. I had intended to talk about this before you saw it as an introduction, but this will be a kind of review of some of the main points of the story of the film. It was written or directed by Kim Tai. I'll talk more about him tomorrow. He directed and filmed and made the music for this film and also for the film Lost Manchurian Shamans. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. The subtitles were translated by myself. And let me read a haiku poem, which maybe you saw in the film, but it's worth reading it again because this is a kind of central metaphor for the film and for all of Ishimure's writing. In the darkness, along the grassy pathway, flower lights. This metaphor of flower lights and the grassy pathway. So we are going through dark times, difficult times with wars and environmental problems, environmental crisis. But she suggests there may be a grassy pathway lit by flower lights, not the bright lights of the cities and baseball parks and such, as she kind of referred to, but flower lights, thousands, millions, trillions of little flower lights that will give us the spiritual power to go forward through the dark times. Similarly, and this is quotation from the film that you just saw, she said, there were stories of the grasses. What would that mean, stories of the grasses? I wanted people to recall those stories, and I want the grasses to welcome us into their souls as well. These are the kinds of stories I wanted to tell. So this interaction between the humans and the non-human world, grasses telling us stories, listening to our stories, being affected together, co-existing, co-evolving. And she also asks the question about what we're doing to victims of wars and environmental disease around the world. She asks, how could we ever have done this to them? Well, them meaning the victims of these disasters, whether it might be Minamata Disease or the Fukushima nuclear disaster in northern Japan, or victims in Afghanistan or in Canada, all over the world. We need to ask, how could we have done these kind of things to them? And she further says that we are being questioned beneath such a gaze by the surviving people. And so we need to take hints from such things as the dew on the grasses. We need to realize that our lives are just like the dew on the grasses. Well, I'll have to leave this question of what is the connection between dew and the grasses to the surviving people in remembering their stories, and what kind of hints can we get from things like the dew on the grasses. But hopefully the documentary you just watched will give you some inspiration, some clue about those kinds of connections. And talking about the way that the Minamata victims have forgiven the perpetrators, the people that caused Minamata disease, specifically the Chiso company and the government and the people who ignored them for so long. For some years, they were angry. There was hatred among those groups, but they worked for reconciliation. And these are the words of some of the patients. They said, we have decided to forgive. It became too much for us to hate them like that. In forgiving, our feelings have become lightened. So this element of reconciliation and bringing together the people who caused the problems with the victims and trying to overcome the hatred and the opposition is also a strong part of Ishimure's ongoing work. And she also points out the fact that sometimes a victim, a patient is so diseased we can't really save their life. We can't completely take away their suffering, but nonetheless, we can't ignore them. We should not deny those problems. We should be with them, even if we cannot relieve their problems completely. So she writes that sometimes the most important thing is just being together, sharing the common humanity of people. That's what prayer is about. Just being at another person's side as one soul alongside another. So Ishimura worked with patients even though she could not help them as a doctor, sometimes just being with them, looking at them, listening to their stories was the most that she could do. But she encourages all of us to look at the victims, don't ignore them, see what they're going through, and then from that, perhaps we will have the foundation to change the problems that have caused their suffering. She refers to the dangerous situation we are in the world now of chaos, and perhaps we're falling into a worse condition, but she also suggests the possibility of rebirth. She said, a cosmic fire which brings about the rebirth of the world. It seems that we may fall into an even more chaotic condition, but I don't think such chaos would necessarily be all for naught. Someday, I think, we may find our way. So there's some dark parts to Ishimure's writing and the film, but she suggests that there is a way, using flower lights, looking towards the future, we may have a rebirth of the world, even if it involves cosmic fire. Hopefully not nuclear warfare, but we've had nuclear explosions, we've had Minamata disease, a lot of indications of those, coronavirus too. All of these things are indications of present chaos, but we should not give up hope. So I'd like to, as a last quotation from her work, I'd like to read the final words of the film, which you just listened to, and think about those ideas once more in relationship to hope. She said, "A grassy pathway to a new world will be lit up by the lights of flowers, and it will emerge faintly, like a flower or a star. A light that is like a symbol of all humans' troubles. Or instead of saying humans, let me use the word life. The life that lies at the center of all life becomes light. Each life with its own light is carrying a heavy load, or rather, I should say, a load is being placed on each back, and each is walking in a faint light, making a pathway towards a place that is far off in the darkness. It is not completely dark. To see that is my hope." Beautiful words of inspiration from her film and from her work. So just as a kind of summary of Ishimure's hope and her not only a kind of airy-fairy hope in the distant future, but down-to-earth, practical, activist-based hope, she suggests the following steps. First is recognition, not denying the problem, seeing problems like Minamata disease or global warming, not denying. Second is reflection, thinking about what are the causes, what can we do, why is it happening. Third step is taking responsibility, doing something, protesting, taking action to change the laws, to change our spirituality, change our ways of life. At the same time, we have to think of the victims. She uses the word requiem, have a requiem for the dead and for the victims. We have to remember them, respect the victims, never lose their stories. And then we have to work for reconciliation, healing among all those involved. The companies who made the problems and the government that was insensitive, but working together with the victims, bringing them together for reconciliation. And finally, hopefully, leading to renewal, a regeneration of stories, and community, culture, nature, and hope. I hope that you got that sense from the film today, and you'll see that in the film tomorrow about the Chinese Manchurian situation, similar to Minamata disease, similar to, I think, some of the indigenous people in Canada and all around the world that are facing similar extinctions of culture and language and customs. Finally, just almost at the end, but I'd like to mention my current work in translating another novel by Ishimure Michiko, which is being regarded as her magnum opus. Perhaps critics will say this is her most important work. Paradise was also path-breaking, but this is a major work that I am in process of translating. Hopefully, within a year or so, it will be out in published in English translation. I've been working for 7 hard years on this, not quite finished yet. I'm getting lots of help from other people. So it's an ongoing project. But briefly mentioning this story, it's a historical novel based on the Shimabara rebellion in Japan in Kyushu area, which took place about 400 years ago. It provides a requiem for 37,000 Japanese who were mostly Christian peasants who were beheaded in one day. Many people don't realize that Japan used to have almost 250,000 Japanese Christians when the first missionaries went over with behind St. Francis Xavier. Many people were converted until the Japanese government finally prohibited it. But there was a long period of over 100 years of interaction. But the final rebellion was crushed on the final day, and hard to imagine, but 37,000 Japanese were beheaded in one day. So she tells the background of this story. This novel took her about 50 years to write it, and it's 600 pages long, epic story, but well worth reading. It deals with the interreligious cooperation and opposition in Japan between Christians and Buddhists and Shinto, a lot of native beliefs. And there was some cooperation, then later there was fighting and rejection, but it also raises the question of the possibility for reconciliation between religions. It also chronicles Japan's early contact with European powers, European religion and technology. It also deals with the Western imperial and colonial expansion and the Japanese fascination with Western culture, and eventually the rejection and isolation of Japan for 250 years during the Edo period, when Japan mostly closed its borders to foreign culture. It also deals with slavery, which was throughout the world, but in Japan too, human trafficking, weapons manufacture and trading. People probably don't realize that Japan went from a country of no guns when they saw the first European guns were brought over. Within a year, Japanese craftsmen had been able to manufacture guns, and for a short period, Japan was the world's leading manufacturer of guns and had the highest gun-holding percent of population of any country in the world for just maybe 3 or 4 decades, until maybe 80 years, until the government outlawed guns and trading with other countries. So this is part of the background of the story, and it also gives a beautiful look at everyday life in Japan 400 years in the past. It introduces over 95 plants, talks about their use in foods and daily customs. So although this story has dark overtones and incident, it's also full of daily life and happiness and inspiration as well. Just one quotation about the story, this again from Paradise in Flowers, but this I hope that you will again connect to the situation in Canada and other places where we're losing extinction of history, extinction of story, culture, and community. There is hope for revitalizing, for reconciling, bringing back those stories, and this is one of the things which literature can contribute to the world. So she talks about it in this quotation. She says, "Only the number of peasants who died in the uprising has been recorded, but certainly they all had names, so I gave them names. But the names of those people, not even one of them remains, and their dead bodies were thrown away like the tossing out of tattered rags. And in the novel, I created scenes that showed how those peasants must have brought happiness to the people around them. There is no proof that this has helped to give those souls peace, I don't know what kind of people my ancestors actually were, but I can't help but thinking of a requiem for their souls. Some of her ancestors were probably Christians, victims of that massacre. So her novel tries to reimagine their life, their happiness. She doesn't know if this will really help their souls in heaven or whatever, but she has this feeling that writing about them, giving them a requiem, reimagining their stories will be some contribution to the this wave of extinction of history, story, culture, and community. So this is the end of my talk today, but I would like to end on the request that we think about the ideas of the film and that I've talked about in her writing, reflect on today's film and Ishimure's ideas, and try to connect them to your experience in Canadian environment and Native peoples and Canadian culture and any other aspects that you may have found interesting in the film or in her writing. So, thank you very much for your attention today. Sorry for the mix-up in the transmission technology, but I hope that we can share our ideas. So I'd like to turn it over to Shoshana Gantz. I know this has been a long night for you, early morning for me. I got up at 4 in the morning to start this. So, but I'd like to give a chance for any comment or question either today, or if you would prefer, we can do more of that tomorrow. But let me ask Shoshana to take over from now. Shoshana, are you there?
Yes, hello, thank you.
Okay,
that was wonderful. I think it made some really wonderful connections between the book we're reading, Lake of Heaven, and the film. And I've watched the film a few times now, and I'm moved, deeply moved every time. So I would love to hear reactions from people who are watching it or watched it for the first time. And I also, if you have questions for BruceAllen about it. And also, this is a really great question, I think, and something that you might be able to share, which is, you know, connections between local experience here and in Newfoundland and some of what was being spoken about and shown to us in the film. So does anyone, I know it's late and that we've been here for a while, but does anyone have any questions that they want to raise tonight? I would encourage you to think about this a little bit, and if you have some questions tomorrow, I think Hannah Jenkins is also going to maybe speak to us a little bit about her reading of Lake of Heaven and the film. So you will get a response tomorrow from one of the students. And I would love to hear your thoughts. I saw lots and lots of connections between Ishimura's work and things that have happened in Newfoundland and are continuing to happen. And that's part of the reason I thought it would be of particular interest here. And I don't want to tell you exactly what I think those are, but I would like you to think about that a little bit, and we can talk about that maybe some more tomorrow. Can you join me in thanking our speaker?
Okay, thank you again. A brave band. It sounds like there were only 7 or 8 people there, but I really appreciate your attention. And sleep on these ideas and come back hopefully tomorrow to watch the film, and let's talk about our thoughts tomorrow. Thank you again.
And usually there are quite a few viewers online as well, so I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people go online to take a look at what you had to say and express interest in the film later on. So thank you so much, and we'll talk again tomorrow night. Or
Great.
Tomorrow morning for you. Okay.
Tomorrow. Okay. Good night.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you. Bye.